Hello, everyone. Thank you for ending your lunch a little bit early to be able to attend this talk. I'm Marco. I'm from Carta. I've been a data professional for about 8+ years. I'm very passionate about building secure and automatable data platforms. And as I said, I'm a senior engineering manager at Carta on the data platform. And today, we're going to be talking about Carta's access management system. So for those of you who may not know, what is Carta? I bet some of you might have received some form of equity-based compensation on Carta because you work for a private company, or maybe you are a founder or a CEO yourself and require or rely on Carta to administrate your corporation. Carta is sort of the infrastructure for private equity. We have roughly 2.5 trillion assets on our platform. We have over 40,000 companies that we administer, and 65% of venture capital is raised on Carta. We are the most trusted by your stakeholders to run a company. The behind-the-scenes part, you need VCs, you need law firms to deal with the private entity or private equity asset administration, and we have a lot of those on Carta who actually do their job on Carta. And we are the most trusted by your employees. 2 million employees globally use Carta for some form of equity-based compensation. Why does Carta care about securing data? Well, if it wasn't obvious on its own, here's our product page. And here's some examples of features and the data that those features contain. So the first, the most familiar to the audience, cap table management, requires several sensitive pieces of data: stakeholder details, company details, investor details, and all of your percent ownerships in that company. In addition, we have another product called 409A valuations, which requires your internal accounting data. How is your company performing so that we can make a really good guess at what the value is for legal annual purposes. And so for the rest of this talk, we'll really be diving into how Carta has sort of taken a different approach to solving access to the platform. We're going to go over some of our gripes with functional roles. We'll do an overview of required concepts for those new to DBT, give you the basics to really understand and get a lot out of this talk. We'll dive into our access system. We'll talk about some cool things that have come about that system. And my biggest goal is where I think this system could go if there's more unity in the community. So let's jump into problems with functional roles. So I want you all to sort of see this as maybe a simple data warehouse that you have. The bottom layer is your most upstream sources of data, maybe a DBT source if you're familiar with that. And then they, through data layering and transformations on DBT, generate a layer of marts. And in functional roles, typically, you assign a role one-to-one to some marts. Well, people are aware of the limitations of this, and we actually had let's say an analytics engineer who really, product was asking, they want to see some of the security PII. So let's create a new intermediate model that brings it in and now expose it in the utilization mart. We don't want this to happen. The data platform does not want to be responsible for accidental drifts in access because of the onset of data transformations and gluing data across sensitive data sets. Additionally, we have another sort of counterexample to this where the marketing role actually wants to look at data from the revenue mart, but typically they only operate in their opportunity mart. And if you look at the underlying data, they should have access to that. They're depending on the exact same DBT sources that generate the revenue mart. But according to functional role rules, they're not allowed to access that mart. And so an analytics engineer instead brings in additional revenue data into that opportunity mart, and we've now created data duplication across our marts at Carta. And so to summarize these functional role issues, I sort of have two gripes. The first, what data is accessible to a functional role is very loosely governed in layered data technology. And who gets access? By definition, we usually follow this one-to-one rule, but it just goes against all of our DRY principles that we strive to achieve as analytics engineers. And so in my opinion, we're sort of back at square one in solving who gets access. And maybe some insight that we had as a team at Carta when we were thinking about this, it's at the end of the day, all of the metadata about what data is sensitive exists in your sources. So instead of governing the most downstream data sets, or your MARTs, govern the most upstream and use lineage to infer downstream access. Let's see what that looks like, but first, let's jump into some necessary DBT concepts so that you all can get the most out of this presentation. So first, I've referenced DBT sources. What are those? You know, for those familiar with an ELT paradigm for data warehousing, DBT sources are the landing spots for data that are brought in from external systems. So you can think about that Airflow job that brings in Postgres data, or that Fivetran connector that brings in Salesforce data. The landing spot for those data sources, we call them DBT sources. And at the end of the day, what is this? It's a very simple configuration file that says where in the data warehouse this table exists. Next, we have DBT lineage. And so again, this is very, very straightforward, but I think everyone has sort of seen this example of a model file where you have a ref or a source of some kind. When you include a reference or a source in a model file, you are effectively establishing a data lineage. So what does that look like? Well, the two sources in here, companies and charges, point to company subscriptions, and that is data lineage. This is viewable in DBT Docs with Core or on DBT Explorer in the cloud. It is also available by parsing the DBT manifest or via the Cloud Discovery API on cloud. Okay, one more knowledge piece. DBT grants. So again, that metadata file that we're all familiar with, DBT grants are just effectively additional metadata that you can specify in that file that tells DBT, you know, when creating this, first create the file, but then make sure that, you know, whatever roles that are specified in that grant statement, give them that access. And it works really well with incremental too. So if this changes over time, DBT knows how to remove that role as needed or add back that role in incremental models as well. Okay, so now let's take a step back and go back to Carta's current data access system. And I want us to recall the flip on this paradigm of worrying about the most downstream assets and instead focusing on the most upstream. And we're going to start with what data is accessible to a role. Okay, so at Carta, we've sort of derived this term that we call an access area. And for a second, I want you to look at this graph or this picture and assume this is a data warehouse with a bunch of tables. Notably, these are all just DBT sources. You probably can derive some conclusions from this data just by reading the names. You know, for example, these are security types, if you're familiar with you know, Carta or private equity. So certificates, warrants, RSUs, options. We sort of treat these as what we would call securities. There's also this other one called security holders. Probably has a bit more PII than the others do. And then we have these two here. These are actually finance data sets. So what are our accounts? What charges have those accounts had on Carta? And so we start to create very logical boundaries between these data sets. And that is effectively what an access area is, or how we define an access area. It's just a collection of similar data sets that need to be granularly accessible. We can create them off of real internal boundaries in how your application is designed or how your legal team classifies sensitive data. You may also just create them for any real reason to invoke granular access in your data warehouse. So we were looking at DBT sources. Now we look at a downstream model. A model can have multiple access areas. A model can be dependent on multiple DBT sources that contain multiple access areas. So you can think of this also sort of like a tag. You can also think of this as being activated or deactivated, but a core takeaway here is that a model can have multiple. So how does this propagation work via DBT lineage? So the first, if you recall, the metadata that we store, or we can optionally store in our DBT schema or config files, propagate internally at Carta via a CI, in-house CI job that basically crawls the DBT graph and appends or grows the set of access areas that are depended on by a downstream model. We then use a very similar in-house CI process to generate or to auto-generate the grants that are required for each of these tables. So a select, if you can recall from the previous slide, when there's a single access area, there's what we call a single read role. But you notice at the bottom there's an interesting combo role that includes all of the access areas that are listed out in that metadata file. So that's how we decide what data gets mapped to a role. Now we need to decide who gets access to this role. And so we're going to go through the tooling that we do at Carta to make this happen. And it's facilitated using Okta OIG. It's just a standard approval workflow for any sort of like app or asset at your company that you need to give access to. So what we start with is, let's say, I don't want to be the one who's manually deciding everybody's access at Carta. And so we have derived sort of a pre-approval block. So you can imagine if you sit in the finance org, you probably need access to some of that finance data. So anything that we can automate based off of like real need for that data, we manage what we call pre-approval groups. And so a request for that access auto-approves. If you are not in that pre-approval group, you go first through your manager. Your manager needs to knowingly accept that you need access to this data, and if they don't, you will not get it. And in some cases where data is utmost sensitive at Carta, we have a secondary line of defense, which is an internal governing body, who we call the owner of that access area. And they get to be the final deciders of whether or not you get access to that data set. So once you've been permitted, now it comes to facilitating this in the data warehouse. So the first thing we do, if this is your first time needing any data in the data warehouse, well, you need to have your own custom user and role. And so if you're new, we first create a per user Snowflake read role. After this, dependent on the specific access that you were looking for, we permit your read role to the single access area read role that we've already auto-generated using DBT grants. And then the final step here is if you've already had previous access, we look at the access areas that you've already had, and we know the combo access areas that exist, and we give you access to those combo areas too. And that's all automated today using this system. And so now, with that in place, let's revisit the gripes of functional roles. So that savvy analytics engineer who tried to bring in some of that data into core securities, well, that just doesn't work because the product role never had clearance on that access area. So irregardless of data layering, that product role is never going to be able to access that data given the changes to the upstream sources. And then when we think about our marketing role, who wanted to access the revenue mart, they already have all of the underlying clearances to access that data. They're able to see revenue data. They're able to see corporation data. Go ahead. Just use the revenue mart. That is A-OK in our books. Cool. So there is a pause. That's sort of the bulk of what we've built out at Carta. But let's dive into some interesting outcomes from this solution. So I've sort of alluded to a subset of access areas. We actually have an additional 2 that are pretty useful. So we have one called common, and this data is not sensitive at all, and you get it by default when you get onto the platform. And it's either, it's not sensitive or everyone truly needs it. Either of those scenarios, we bundle that data into common. And then the last, I'm not going to claim that every piece of data is, perfectly annotated. And so we have a catch-all for things that aren't. But the caveat here is nobody else at Carta gets to access it until it's annotated. So only the data team is able to see that data. Some really cool things that we've done, because you can imagine that we have to really create awareness around access areas at Carta and what you need when you go to a dashboard or when you go to a look or when you go to some sort of derived content. We propagate the access areas and auto-generate descriptions in our BI tools so that folks know what access areas to request. So if you get an error that your user can't access this table, you can actually just go self-serve in Okta OIG to ask for the access area that you need. And we actually have an internal landing page in Slack that you can sort of use to figure out what you currently have. So it makeshift today, but you can figure out very easily what you need to request from what you're missing. So now I want to go into some things that I'd love to see exist to sort of derive or land at a better future version. So the first thing, we, the data platform, are currently responsible for managing all of this metadata in the DBT sources. They are not the only place at Carta where this metadata exists. We have the upstream source of truth that creates this table or that creates this Kafka event that sometimes has that metadata. It'd be really cool if we could instead derive these access area rules from even further upstream metadata so that we weren't responsible for doing that ourselves. And so ways that it's easier to integrate Django with DBT or schema registries in Kafka with DBT, that metadata could be super powerful to us on the data team. Next is sort of the downstream systems. So there's sort of two ways that this, I'm sure all of you are familiar with. The first scenario we have here is that the BI tool actually has a shared user. And that shared user sort of gets access to a lot of things, and the BI tool is the one who's actually deciding what data you can and cannot have access to. The second option here is what we commonly refer to as a pass-through auth method. And every user in the BI tool has an associated user in the warehouse, and the warehouse is the source of truth for the permissions on data. At Carta, if you don't do scenario 2, we will not adopt that BI tool. It is just too much to manage permissions and sometimes multiple BI tools that exist at Carta today. We have to create a BI tool experience for the self-serve user potentially using Looker. We have SQL Power users who want to use tools like Metabase, and managing that in multiple systems is just not an ideal situation for us. So we resort to requiring scenario 2 before any BI conversations at Carta. Next, some of you probably were like, this seems like annoying to manage. I don't want to think about combo grants. Could somebody else own that? And I actually think we could. I think if the data warehouse sort of by design had a permission system that required multiple roles, optionality, it would offload a lot from our plate, which would be great. And potentially, allow us to do this in a more seamless way where we don't need to integrate this down the line. And then next, permission errors. We get these, occasionally, especially with folks who aren't familiar with going to self-serve in the descriptions. They get a permission denied error because the BI tool doesn't have that preferred UI because we did not build on top of the BI specific permissions. We know how these things work. We know what it means when you are denied access to this relation. Why can't we just enrich this method with exactly what you need to go do to self-serve? I think that would completely eliminate everything that we receive in Slack today. And we're a bit quick, but I'll close out for what we've been able to do at Carta. So this project has allowed us to very confidently govern fractional access to data. I think we are very confident when we can say, a subset of people can access security data because we know that we're describing it in the utmost part of the graph that allows us to say this with conviction. It's allowed us to reuse data sets across functional teams. And that's great. It's helping us achieve dry principles. And finally, my favorite is access to Carta is no longer a manual process done by an analytics engineer or a data engineer. It is automated end-to-end. And we are very happy about being able to focus on better problems than access. Thank you so much for your time today. This has been a really great pleasure to get to come speak at DBT. And I will open the floor to questions.
Yeah, I have one question. So you showed me that you made one role per user, right? And you also here at the end, you said if the system could handle more roles simultaneously, you'd be happy. But Snowflake actually does offer that. So it's called secondary security.
Oh, yeah. So use secondary roles. Is that sort of what you're referring to? Our challenge with that is we still have the multiple persona hat that we sometimes need to play, where a data engineer might need to prescribe admin temporarily. So we don't want all secondary roles to combine. And so for that reason, we avoided it. Because we have this temporary admin access that we sometimes give to our internal team, and we don't want that to be by default. But there might be other ways to iron that out, but that's what we sort of avoided.
I think there are other ways.
Cool.
The metadata trickling down the lineage, is that something you do at runtime using your own code? Do you commit that back to a Git repo? How does that process actually work? And maybe you could also just kind of mention how much code did you write for all of this to work? Is this a couple hundred lines? Is this a large project? What's that like?
It's a really good question. So we basically have a blocking CI step on any sort of development branch before moving to master that will include automatic updates to schema YAML files that propagate that metadata. So you can't push until that CI check runs. These are simple scripts. I've personally used DBT manifest all the time. We parse it. We actually put that data in our data warehouse where we can. It's very easy to traverse the graph. And you're not dealing with a giant graph. So there might be optimal ways to traverse a graph. I would confidently say that this is, in the realm of a few hundred lines of code. Yep.
You didn't mention during the presentation, but you answered in the question that you have the temporary admin. Do you have other, are the temporary workflows or recertification workflows something that you're thinking about adding to the system, or is not a big deal at Carta?
It's been something that we've thought about rolling out maybe more widely to, read-only users, not just administrators of the warehouse. And we think that we could also do that with things like OctaOIG, and they actually have really nice tools where you can sort of after a certain amount of time remove that role. Snowflake also has that embedded too. So it's definitely something we've considered. There's a fine line for data that people actually need and the resistance that you want to create. We still want to democratize data at Carta. We still want you to be able to derive insights off of this data. So it's a balance act. I think it's something that we definitely we have in the back of our mind and we consider it. But we also do still want data to be accessible to the users. Okay. I am happy to stay here if there's anybody who's shy to ask a public question and would love to chat with me after the fact. And thanks again, everyone, for coming to the talk today.